Hi, this is Christine with Zeidman Development, and today I would like to show you how criteria sets help you avoid duplicate records in the Raiser's Edge when you import using Importacular. So there are two different things that you can do with the criteria sets. The first one is when you're working with constituents, and that's available to everybody. And the second piece is working with relationships. So if you have the destination for individual relationships, if you have the destination for organization relationships, you can use those criteria sets to work with the relationships and making sure that you're not adding duplicate relationships. Because those aren't available to everyone, I'm not going to cover those in this video, but I do want to explain that because you can see them in the same place. Just FYI, you can see your criteria sets in two places as well. So right now I'm on the main screen for Importacular, and you can see your criteria sets here. If I open the criteria sets on this screen, I'm going to affect my criteria sets as a default for Importacular overall. So if I want to make a change that affects all of my templates and all of my data sources, this is the area where I would do that from. So I'd go up to the top where it says File, Criteria Sets and Help, click on Criteria Sets, and I can click on Open Individual Criteria Set. And it does give me a warning to let me know that this is going to change the default sets for all new templates going forward for all users of Importacular. So if you only want to do criteria sets for one template, you would open the criteria sets from one template. So let's go ahead and let's do that from that location just so you can see both locations. So I'm going to go ahead and say no. Let's go ahead and let's work with one of our templates. I'm going to go ahead and pick a quick file here. So let's go ahead and use an iWave sample. And from this point, let's go ahead and pick our iWave template and let's do our criteria sets for our template. So here you can see we have file, template, and criteria sets. And again, we have those options for our constituent criteria sets and our relationship criteria sets. Let's go ahead and work with our individual constituent sets. So we're going to open that up, and this has the standard criteria sets that has been built into Importacular for all users. So this is just the default. You can change this at any time. So whatever works for your import, you can change these for just template by template. So the reason I showed you that at the beginning is you could change your standards for all new templates moving forward. You can also change it template by template depending on your data file. So for example, the first row in this criteria set is basing a match off of a constituent ID. If my file doesn't have a constituent ID, I might want to take that off. If my file has a constituent import ID rather than a constituent ID, I might want to change that. So let's change it so you can see how we would change it from a constituent ID to a constituent import ID. I'm going to go ahead and open that row, and I'm going to uncheck the box here for constituent ID, and I'm going to check the box for the import ID, and then I'll click Save. So now you can see that this is based off of the import ID rather than the constituent ID. This is in row 1, which does matter. As it says, criteria sets are evaluated from first to last. So if we have an exact match on our import ID, we can really safely assume that we have the exact same record. However, if we don't have an exact match on the import ID, then Importacular is going to go to the next row, and it's going to compare to look and see, do we have a match for this record in Raiser's Edge? So row number 2 is looking for the same email address, and it's saying if it has the same email address, it's an exact match. Sometimes that is true, and sometimes that works very well for some organizations. For other organizations where you have a lot of families sharing email addresses, so if you have a school and you have parents and their students and they've shared email addresses and both of them have the same email address, this could cause you some false matches. If you do a lot of events and you have families registering for the event, all of them with the same email address, again, you could end up with multiple false matches, or not even necessarily a false match, but where it's matching to both the parent and the child. They're both parents or two spouses or siblings or whatever the case may be. So one of the things you could do in those kinds of a situation is you can make this a little bit tighter of a match. So I can change it from being just the email address to being the email address and the first name. I could also add the checkbox here for the first name equivalence. If you have a lot of situations where you have a father and a son who have the same first and last name, we could also add something like the suffix, just to make sure that we catch situations where those match. So you have the ability to add more settings here to make this a tighter match so that it can be more specific. We also have the option to add additional rows. So for example, let's say I want to add a new row for my individuals, and I want to add based on the same first name and the same address. So maybe I am thinking that I've had people who have gotten married or changed their surnames for some reason, and that I'm not finding them in my system. So I want to check for a different way. So I could change and say first name and address has to match, and then we're going to count that as a match. So now I can add my record that I've just created. I can move that up, and I could say, well, that's probably a good match to say that we want the address and the first name. That's probably a good match. It's maybe not an exact match, but it would be a good match. Another thing that we could do is we can open up, when we work in our criteria sets here, we can come to this advanced area and we can limit based off of a query or off of an attribute or off of a constituent code. So these will slow down your processing time, but I point them out because there are times when these are extremely helpful. So if you are doing an import of students and you know that all of the students in your system would have a specific constituent code of student, you could use this as a way to filter and only look at the student records in Raiser's Edge rather than looking at the parent records or the grandparent records or any other records that might complicate what you're working with. So you could use that constituent code as a way to filter it down. That does slow the processing down because it adds extra layers to the matching, but it also makes your matching a bit more reliable. So depending on how you want to work with this, that is an option. You could also filter based off of an attribute. So if we only wanted to filter with people who have a favorite baseball team, we can filter that way. Or you can filter based off of a query. So you can restrict the lookup. You can create a query using whatever criteria you want. You can search here, find your query, link it to this, and it will filter down based on that query. So if you have situations where you have significant number of people in your database with the same name and you're trying to identify, and maybe you don't have some of that biographical information, but you know that they have a constituent code of student, you can use that to match based off of something like a constituent code and just a first and last name, no address. So if we know that they're a student and their first name and the last name match, then we can assume that it's the same student. Maybe not always, but that's just an example of how that could work. So I hope that this helps you understand a little bit of how you can work with these criteria sets in order to adjust who in particular matches your data in your import file to the data that's already in Raiser's Edge, and how you can come in and you can customize this and you can tweak it and you can really make it your own. Thanks for listening. I hope that this has been helpful, and please join us again on another video.